Welcome to First Person, where we talk about the issues that impact public education and the individuals who shape those issues. Today we'll be meeting with Delaine Eastin, former State Superintendent of Public Instruction in California and gubernatorial candidate. I'm Wes Smith, and this is First Person. Well, Delaine, such a pleasure to have you here. I know you remember this because I remind you every time that I see you, but in 1999, it was my very first administrative position. I was a principal, site principal, and our superintendent told us that you were going to be visiting our school. I hadn't even started the job yet, but he wanted me to be at this meeting. And at the meeting, there were a bunch of the dignitaries from the district community, and my superintendent, Barry Reed, said, "And this is Wes Smith, the principal of the school." And you looked at me, you looked at Barry, you looked at me, you looked back at Barry, and you said, "Is he even old enough to drive?" And I remember laughing, and it put me at ease. And then since then, I just marveled at what you did for students as SPI and since. So thank you. It means a lot for me that you're here today.
Thank you, Wes. It's my privilege to be here today. I have the greatest respect for you and your organization.
Thank you. I know you're highly regarded with our members. Well, let's talk about your current endeavors. You're running for governor. Tell us why, after you've had this great career, you've done so much, why the gubernatorial race?
Well, I left the field a few years ago, and I had really created quite a bit of momentum around education. I'd moved us from 47th in per pupil spending up to 27th, and it felt like we were heading in the right direction. And class size had been reduced. We had first ever performance and content standards for the state. We had brought the arts back. I mean, there were a lot of things happening that were really, really promising. And when I left, I first went to DC and ran the National Institute for School Leadership, and then I taught at Mills College as a distinguished visiting professor of educational leadership. But I continued to be involved in California in a variety of different organizations, dealing with children's nutrition, dealing with educational equity, dealing with opportunities for dropout recovery, different things. And as I looked, I began to become worried about the slowly cutting away at the underpinnings of education again. When the recession hit, child development was only 3% of the state budget, but it suffered 20% of the cuts. Today in California, we've got 300,000 plus families waiting for child care. That means underemployed moms and dads. It means kids that are in sketchy latchkey situations in some cases. It just means it's bad for development overall because the steepest curve of learning is 0 to 5. I also watched them try to balance the budget by stealing money from F1rst and from a bunch of other, taking money out of mental health. I mean, really foolish things. And adding insult to injury, K-12, of course, was underfunded. We saw a bill vetoed to create kindergarten as a mandatory reality. We've just seen the class sizes shoot up. They're the biggest in America. Even though we have the largest percentage in number of poor children and the largest percentage in number of English learners, we are 41st now in per pupil spending. So a state with those demographics, and the most expensive state in the union, should be in the top 10 in per pupil spending, not in the bottom 10. And while I completely believe that the whole concept between local control funding formula about local control funding formula is right on, the fact is, if the whole system is underinvested, it really isn't a solution. It's robbing Peter to pay Paul, but not overall solving the problems and challenges. Last but not least, I also believe very highly in higher education. And there again, we've seen since '65, we built 1 UC, 3 CSUs, 2 community colleges, total of 6. In that same period of time, we built 22 prisons. So I'm running because I think budgets are statements of values. When I look at the budget of California, those are not my values.
And I've heard you talk about this so many times, and it is absolutely criminal. We're either 6th or 8th largest economy in the world, and we can't get back into the top 20 in per pupil spending, and we should be in the top 5. I've also heard you talk about in the 80s, looking back, we're in the top 5 in funding and top 5 globally in performance. It does matter. You know these education issues better than any of your competitors. What are some of the other issues that are a priority for you?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that, because sometimes people say I'm in one-note samba. I will say that I am #1 for education. And for the record, the state constitution, which they take an oath to uphold and defend, Article 16, Section 8, says from all monies there shall first be set aside the money for education of children through institutions of higher education. It's actually in the state constitution. But beyond that, we are falling down in so many areas. For example, housing. The state of California has the oldest children living at home with their parents, largely because they can't afford to move out. But we have too little affordable housing for our teachers, our firefighters, our police officers, and even first-time, high-tech people. In the Bay Area right now, if you're not making $100,000, you're low income. I've met too many families that are driving 2.5 hours each way to their jobs. There's a principal down at Treasure Island who lives in Sacramento. She takes the train and then she gets on Uber, and it costs her a lot of money to commute. And I will just say to you, I think housing is huge, healthcare is huge. The idea that we have the most expensive healthcare in the world and not all our people are covered, that's nuts.
Right.
And so, Mark Twain said the problem with common sense, not very common, but we ought to get more for what we pay for, and every person in California should be given affordable health care. If Massachusetts can figure it out under a Republican governor, the state of California should be able to figure it out under a Democratic governor. I'm also a big one, though, generally on infrastructure. The truth be known, the state of California right now is in, and I did a lot of work in this area in the legislature. The truth is that our state is not doing long-range planning. It makes cities and counties do a long-range plan. But the state of California long-range water plan dates from Governor Brown. That would be Pat Brown, 1957. The Higher Education Master Plan, 1960. And so we don't have a long-range plan for education at all. And so in the end, we must get somebody who can see the horizon and who will make plans based on the horizon. Make plans so that the kids that are growing up in California today will have magnificent tomorrows. And I really believe that, thank God we've had so many half-cent sales taxes passed for transportation locally. And the 2 counties I represented in the legislature were actually the first 2 to pass them. But I also carried a bill when Caltrans told them they were going to have to stand in a 12-year-long line. I carried a bill that allowed them to build the projects without Caltrans oversight if they had to get a certified construction firm and contractor to do the oversight. But honestly, it's ridiculous that we were almost going to just say the half-cent sales tax will be. Imagine what trouble we'd be in if we hadn't had 23 half-cent sales tax measures passed with mostly 2/3 votes now.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that, because you do hear the critics mentioning that your experience was too focused on just education, which isn't true in the Assembly, and some of the things you just shared demonstrate that you have much broader perspective than education. That being said, I'm biased, and I admit that. I believe education is the most important topic for this or any other election. I believe that as we do a better job of educating all students in this state, we'll see those other dynamics positively affected. Health, wellness, social issues, all of them are affected by a thriving public education system. So I appreciate you saying that, and still I'm behind you as you talk about education, because for me it's the most important.
Well, to be 41st in per pupil expenditure and #1 in per prisoner expenditure is disgraceful.
That's right.
And in that period when we were building those 6 colleges, we built 22 prisons. It's ridiculous.
Yep.
So somebody with values needs to be the governor. Somebody with a brass backbone who's going to, challenge the legislature to do the right things and not just let them kind of, muddle through. We really do need somebody who leads the state of California in a direction that will allow us to do some of this really heavy lifting in infrastructure, in the environment. I carried a lot of legislation. I carried the biggest ever landfill cleanup bill. We had a bunch of toxic waste sites all over the state. I carried the bill that requires a bottle manufacturer in California to use recycled glass. I carried legislation that says you can't just throw those washers and dryers and refrigerators in the landfill because they're loaded with chemicals. And so my credentials in consumer protection, in transportation, and infrastructure generally are terrific. So are my economic development credentials. So I've really paid a lot of attention also to welfare and to the things we need to do to get Californians off of welfare and into the workforce.
Yeah, I bet you look forward to sharing those messages with those folks that assume otherwise. Speaking of the critics, they'll talk about the difficulty raising money. You know, without the endorsement of the Democratic Party or those deep pockets, how does someone like you raise the funds necessary to not just compete, but win the election?
Well, first, that is the hardest part of the election. It has always been difficult for me to raise money. I was on the city council in Union City. I was not the top fundraiser, but I did win the election. I was running for the assembly, and I was replacing the most conservative Democrat, and at first the Democrats were not going to support me because they said I was too young and too liberal, but I wound up winning the election, and frankly, the Republicans rolled the store in for a 2-week period to try to take it away from me. But they polled at the beginning. They spent the money and bought the ads and did all the TV and stuff. And then they polled again, and we were still ahead, so they walked away. Bottom line is, when I ran for the superintendency, it was '94. That was one year. Prop 187 was on the ballot. Pete Wilson and the Republicans took 5 of the constitutional officers. Only 3 went to Democrats. Gray Davis, Lieutenant Governor, Kathleen Connell, Controller, who's self-financed, and me. And so I didn't have the most money, but I did have the best organization, and I worked the hardest. And that's what I would love it if, you know, some people watching this film who believe in me would make modest contributions. The maximum contribution you can make is $29,090, or it's ridiculous.
Right.
So, but if people could make a $92 contribution a month or a $29 contribution a month, over time it would be enough. So that's what I tell everybody. I don't have to have the most money. I have to have enough money. If I can get my message out, I can win this election.
Oh, that's great. When we come back, we'll talk about some of the issues that are near and dear to both ACSA and Delaine's heart. Social justice, equity, and diversity issues. We'll be back in just a minute.
California has 6.2 million public school students. Here at the Association of California School Administrators, we care about every single one. We're honored to bring you the stories of 21 students who fought tirelessly to get to where they are today. They will inspire you, and they will move you. But most of all, they'll remind you what is best about California's public schools.
Welcome back to First Person. Our guest today is Delaine Eastin, gubernatorial candidate and former state superintendent of public instruction. Delaine, in looking at your bio and just from knowing you, I know that you were the first female state superintendent of public instruction, and if elected, to be the first governor who is a female. ACSA is very, very passionate about our equity and diversity issues, promoting diversity and fighting for equity in this state. Personally, having been raised by a very, very strong grandmother and single mom, I can't tell you how much I appreciate the role of strong women in our society and in our profession. How have you been such a vanguard in politics to be the first female superintendent of public instruction, to be on the precipice of being the first female governor? What kind of support did you have, mentoring? How are you here, and how have you broken through so many of those ceilings?
Well, I had great parents who were, in fact, wonderful role models in different ways. But my dad, you know, my dad's mother was a woman who said, the most important thing you can have in this world is to have an education. And that's what he said to me. So the machinist and the dress clerk could have bought a bigger house for less money, but they bought the little house that cost more because the schools were better. And when the time came for me to be sworn in as State Superintendent of Public Instruction, I went back to Britton Acres Elementary School to be sworn in. Most people go to the library or the Capitol or the Secretary of State's office or somewhere fancy. But I went to Britton Acres. And I wanted to make the statement it had changed my life. Because it was at Britton Acres that the counselor, we had counselors then, I mean, we're dead last as the state with counselors right now, but the counselor called my mother and said, nurse actually, it was a nurse called my mother and said she needs to get her eyes checked. And I needed to wear glasses. The nurse knew was right. And it was the librarian who suggested that I read all the biographies about women. And then all through school, I had a variety of men and women who were teachers who were really strong on, you know, thinking of me as equal. And I was encouraged to go get into advanced placement courses and take university prep courses by the counselor at the high school. And I was in college prep, and I didn't know the difference. She actually bawled me out for not being in university prep. So I look back and I see all these amazing people who helped me. And when I was teaching at De Anza College, I did a Women See How They Run conference, and Leona Eglin was in the legislature, and somebody asked the question, do the women in the legislature have a caucus the way they have in the Congress? And she said, well, and this is the 70s, late 70s, she said, if we called ourselves a caucus, we could meet in a phone booth. We're both happy a third woman has just been elected. So when I got to the legislature, 75 years after women had the vote in California, 1986, there had only been a total of 31 women ever. And now we've seen the research. When you get to a critical mass in a field or in a country or in a legislature, in a Congress, or you get to a critical mass of women, values change. More is invested in education, families, healthcare, and seniors. And that's my belief, that it's time for California to stop rattling the chains at the prison gate and start to focus on what is the best economic development program? Education. What is the best crime prevention program? Education. What is the best welfare reform program? Education. And so I will just say that I believe that I was blessed to have been given lots of opportunities when I was accepted at Davis. My parents had no money. My dad had been on strike, and they'd used their little bit of savings pretty much to keep paying the house payments and so forth. And my mother didn't think they could afford to send me. And I went into my father and said in a mature voice, Daddy, sugar says I can't go to Davis. And my dad went into my mother and said, what's this about Delaine not going to Davis? My mother explained that she talked to the bank manager. They would have to borrow the money at 7.5% interest and pay it back on 3-year loans. They'd be paying twice their house payment when I was able to take out the loans myself. At that time, women could not borrow money until they were 21. Men could borrow at 18. And so in the end, my folks took out the money, took out the loans, and they paid twice their house payment by the time I was 21 and started borrowing the money myself. But my education opened a million doors for me, and that's what I want for every student.
As our female leaders look at the disparity of representation in the highest level of leadership in our profession in California, especially women of color, what advice would you give them? What would you say to those women that are watching this now as they're aspiring to lead large districts, large counties, et cetera?
Well, I do think it's important that women who are leaders make sure they're visible. And the women also have to support each other. Women and good men have to support the role of women. Once in the caucus, I made a suggestion, and they kind of poo-pooed it and passed over it, and 10 minutes later, one of the assemblymen made the same suggestion. And Jackie Spear, to her great credit, stepped up and said, wait a cotton-picking minute, that's exactly what Delaine suggested 10 minutes ago. Well, I don't think it was exactly. And she said, wasn't it, Delaine? It was exactly what I said. And so I think women have to stand up for each other as well. But, men of quality are not threatened by women's equality. So I've had a lot of men and women who were mentors as teachers, as in the private sector, in local government, in my life. I've had a lot of wonderful men who supported the idea that women should hold up half the sky. And I think it will improve education. I think it will improve our society if more women are allowed to take leadership positions, whether it's a Fortune 500 company, a large school district, or a big nonprofit. The reality is we ought to always, in this democracy, give the very, very greatest attention to equity and equality. And if we do that, many more women will step to the front of the line.
Again, a very, very primary focus for ACSA is, again, supporting the diversity in the state and fighting for equity. And this is one of those equity areas, gender issues. There are lots of equity areas. We just recently defined for our own board equity being the practice of giving those who need more when they need it, right? Besides gender issues, what are some of those other equity issues in the state that you're going to be fighting for? Some of those inequities that have to be addressed from the top leadership in the state of California.
Well, certainly we still have to worry a lot about racial discrimination in our state and in our nation. The latest pronouncements by the president that somehow white men are being discriminated against going into colleges would be laughable if it weren't so frightening. So we have to worry about racial inequities, we have to worry about income inequalities, we have to hold the flag for our LGBTQ youth, and I did have the first LGBT task force as superintendent to give guidance to school districts because we had a number of incidents and we had people asking, how do we deal with this? And so I got death threats, believe it or not, but at the time it was groundbreaking. I will just say that I think the beauty of America, I mean, one of the things that I found so appalling is somebody in Trump's cabinet, their administration, saying that give me you're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, really wasn't there when it first came. Right. Well, the poem was written by a woman, Emma Lazarus, and the Colossus, but everybody else I know believes that that poem is part and parcel of who we are, that we must, of course, protect those who come to this country as dreamers, who are our students, but who may or may not be here legally. Or they may be here legally, they may have been born here, but their parents may not. We don't want to break up that family. So we've got to worry about protecting all of our children from any kind of discrimination or anything that limits their potential. I have a Down syndrome first cousin who was born a few years before I, and so she actually started to school before there was special education. But her mother was a teacher, and her dad was a rock star, really. He was a wonderful father, and together they made sure that my cousin had a wonderful training and wonderful beginnings in education. So she had a job she worked at over 30 years until she had a stroke. She's still alive. She's in her 70s. And all of that by way of saying, yes, we have special needs kids. Probably Einstein and Edison were special needs kids. And they'll have different abilities to contribute, but they can all contribute if we just keep our wits about us and help them to find a great future. Dream big. That's America's promise.
Yeah, I love that poem. And in fact, when I visited the Statue of Liberty, waited in line a half an hour just to see the plaque and to read it. There was a long, long line, a lot of people there that day. And when I got up there and was reading, I looked to my left, my wife, and she's crying.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, that's really the power of this country and the power of our democracy. And it's more than just an experiment. It's a practice, and we've got to improve that practice. And I'm glad that this is such a passionate issue for you, because ACSA needs allies in this equity war, if you will. The thing we care most about in ACSA are the 6.2 million students in this state that deserve no less than the highest quality public education we can provide, that they have adults fighting for their rights every day is absolutely one of the things they deserve. How, as governor, are you going to benefit the 6.2 million students in California?
Well, I mean, first thing, we must have an honest conversation about the level of investment for our children. And if people coming out of the greatest depression and economic depression in the history of the world, followed by the greatest world war, could figure out how to be so generous such that we were 5th of the 50 states, tied with New York in per pupil spending, top 10 in achievement, top 10 in investment, how do we figure out how to do that today? Because as you said, California is the 6th largest economy. I just saw an article in the newspaper that we may soon pass Britain. We may be 5th.
Wow.
And so we are an affluent community. And yet we have somehow gotten on the wrong track when it comes to investing in the education of our children. And whether you're in a rural, remote part of this state and are begging for broadband, or whether you're in one of our urban ginormous schools, the truth is that we need to make sure that every child has an opportunity for a wonderful opportunity for preschool and child development, a terrific K-12 experience, including a full-day kindergarten, a small enough class size, especially in elementary grades, so that each teacher can connect with each child. And I had a teacher who said to me recently, "You don't know me, but you added 6 years to my career." I had 35 kids in a second grade, and frankly, I couldn't remember all their names at the end of the week. For the first time in my career, I did not know every child's name or needs. And I thought, I'm going to do this one more year, and then I'm just going to retire. And the next year, class size reduction came. And I had 20 students, and I knew all their names. And so I taught for 6 years after that year because I felt that I was more effective. I think it's really important that we understand that everybody at the school site needs the opportunity to relate to these kids in a wonderful way, and that they feel that we're all on a mission. The state is on a mission to educate our kids. I asked my dad when I got accepted at Davis why it was, I was kind of surprised it was only $82.50 a semester to go to University of California. And he said, well, honey, they think you're going to get a great education and get a better job and pay more taxes. I think he was spot on, and I think we've sort of lost our way when we fail to realize that these children will pay us back. Either they'll pay us back with high quality work as teachers, as firefighters, as computer programmers, as engineers, as doctors, as nurses. They'll pay us back, but frankly, if they are the technician that calibrates the machine when the doctor orders the test, their job is every bit as important as the doctor's, and they need to be highly skilled to calibrate that machine. And so we need to understand that education became more important as we were disinvesting. And it's more important than ever that somebody step up and say, education is job one in California.
Well, Delaine, I can't thank you enough. In 1999, when I met you, as I mentioned, I hadn't started my tenure as a principal yet. I didn't know what it meant to be a leader at the site level. I'd been in classes and read books, but I saw you fighting. I saw you fighting for students, and it taught me that day that that was job one for me, to fight for the students in my care. So I want to thank you for that. Thank you for spending time with us today.
Well, I'm honored to be with you, Wes. I think the world of you and ACSA. I have greatest respect. And I will just say, my favorite quote is from Neil Postman. Children are living messages we send to a time we will never see. I want us to send a great message to the future. And that's why I'm running. And I really appreciate your time and the time of every administrator who's watching this, because I know you are not working 8-hour days out there. You're working more than that. And great leaders do make a huge difference. So thank you for your leadership.
What a perfect quote to end on. We want to thank Delaine Eastin for taking time out of her busy schedule to come and sit with us. We appreciate her leadership as SPI, Assemblywoman, and now as she works towards the governorship in California. Thanks for tuning in to First Person. We'll see you next time.